In this Blender video, I'll be demonstrating how to make an animation of a fantasy text factory. The animation is about 12 seconds long. For this video, I'll be using Blender version 2.77a. Let's start by creating a new project. So from the File menu, select New, and then click on Reload Startup File. To make it easier to see the scale and location of the objects that we'll be adding, switch from Perspective to Orthographic View by pressing 5 on the number pad. Now delete the cube by right-clicking on it to make sure that it's selected, and then press X. We're going to add a sphere at the center, so make sure that the 3D cursor is centered. To center the 3D cursor, press Shift-S and select Cursor to Center. Now press Shift-A and add a UV sphere. Then press 1 on the number pad for front view and zoom in. Next, let's make some modifications to it. So press Tab for Edit Mode. So that we can easily select vertices on the front and back at the same time, switch to wireframe mode. Now press A once or twice until everything is deselected. Then press B for Border Select and select these vertices on the top. Then press B again and select these vertices on the bottom. Then press X to delete and select vertices. Now press A to select all of the vertices. We're going to rotate it on the X-axis, so press R, then X, then 90, then Enter. This is what it looks like so far. Now press Tab to switch to Object Mode, and then switch back to Solid View. Next, we're going to add a thickness to it, so add a Solidify modifier. Set the thickness value to 0.2. Now we'll smooth it out, so add a Subdivision surface modifier. Set the View and Render values to 2, and then click the Smooth button. When we added the Subdivision surface modifier, it rounded off the edges. So we're going to add some more geometry to it to sharpen the edges. So press Tab for Edit Mode. We're going to add geometry by using loop cuts. To add a loop cut, press Ctrl R, position the cursor over one of the edges to be cut, and left-click. Then slide the loop near the front edge and left-click again. Now we'll do the same to the other side. So press Ctrl R, position the cursor over one of the edges to be cut, and left-click. Then slide the loop near the edge and left-click again. Now press Tab for Object Mode. Next, we're going to duplicate this object and scale it down in size. So press Shift-D to duplicate, and then right-click to place it at the same location as the original object. Then scale it down in size by pressing S, then 0.78, then Enter. Now we'll make some modifications to the large object, so right-click it to select it. Then press Tab for Edit Mode. We're going to be selecting faces, so press the Face Select button. Then press 3 on the number pad for right side view. Then press B for Border Select and select the 4 center rows of faces. We're going to delete all of the faces except the ones that are currently selected. So from the Select menu, select Inverse to reverse the selected faces. Then press X to delete and select Faces. The top and bottom are rounded, so we're going to add more geometry to make the edges sharper. So press Ctrl R, position the cursor over one of the top edges, and left-click. Then slide it near the top and left-click again. Now repeat this for the bottom. So press Ctrl R, position the cursor over one of these bottom edges and left-click. Then slide it near the bottom and left-click again. Next, we're going to duplicate this object. So press A twice to select all. Then press Shift-D to duplicate, and then right-click to place it at the same location as the original object. Now we're going to rotate the duplicate into position. When we do this, we want it to rotate around where the center of this object used to be before we deleted any faces. To accomplish this, we'll move the 3D cursor to our rotation point and then rotate around the 3D cursor. By the way, if the 3D cursor hasn't moved during this project, then it's already in the correct position. But just in case it was accidentally moved, we'll set its position. So press Tab for Object Mode. then press Shift S and select Cursor to Selected. Then press Tab for Edit Mode. Now change the pivot point to 3D Cursor. Next, rotate on the Y-axis by pressing R, then Y, then 90, then Enter. Now we'll duplicate and rotate 2 more times. So press Shift D to duplicate and then right-click. Then rotate by pressing R, then Y, then 90, then Enter. Then press Shift D and right-click. Then press R, then Y, then 90, then Enter. Now we're going to rotate the whole object by 45 degrees. So press A twice to select all. Then rotate by pressing R, then Y, then 45, then Enter. We're done rotating for now, so change the pivot point back to median point. Now press Tab for Object Mode. Next, let's add a floor. So press Shift A and add a mesh plane. Then scale it up in size by pressing S, then 100, then Enter. Then move it down on the Z-axis by pressing G, then Z, then -1.1, then Enter. Now we'll set the material for the floor. So click the Material button and then click New. Then come up here and change this from Blender Render to Cycles Render. Then click the Use Nodes button. We'll keep the diffuse material and the white color. Next we'll set up the lighting. So press 1 on the number pad for front view and then zoom out until you can see the lamp. Then right-click the lamp to select it and then click the Object Data button if it's not already selected. Make sure the points lamp is selected and then set the size to 1. Then click the Use Nodes button and set the strength to 1000. Now we'll move the lamp into position. So drag it down until it's 2 large grid divisions above the center of our objects. Then drag it sideways until it's 3 large grid divisions to the left of the object's centers. Now we're going to duplicate this lamp. So press Shift D and drag it up by 1 large grid division. Next, hold down the Control key and press 3 on the number pad for left side view. Then drag the top lamp sideways until it's straight above our objects. Then right-click the bottom lamp to select it and drag it sideways until it's 4 large grid divisions to the right of the object's centers. This is what our lighting setup looks like from a different angle. Now we're going to set up the materials for our 2 objects. So right-click the outside object to select it. Then click the Material button and then click New. Set the color to a hex value of 5F B600. Next, we're going to make some changes to the material that will make it look like a glossy plastic. So switch to the Compositing Screen layout and click the Shader Nodes button. These are the nodes that control the material for the cylinder. Down in the 3D View window, switch to Rendered View. To make the material look like a glossy plastic, we're going to mix in a glossy shader. So press Shift A and add a mix shader. Drop it on the connection coming out of the diffuse shader. Then press Shift A and add a glossy shader. Connect it to the bottom mix shader input and set the roughness value to 0.02. Next, press Shift A and select Input and then Layer Weight. Connect the facing output to the mix shader's factor input. This will control how the diffuse and glossy shaders are blended together. The surface areas that are angled away from the camera will use more of the glossy shader than the surface areas that are angled toward the camera. For the blend value, I found that a value of 0.15 works well for glossy plastic. Now let's set the material for the other object. So right-click the inside object to select it. Then click the small button next to the New button and select the green material. This number 2 indicates that this material is being used by 2 objects now. Click it to make a copy of the material. Now change the diffuse color to a hex value of FFE000. Next, we're going to add some text, so switch back to the default screen layout. Then make sure that the 3D cursor is centered by pressing Shift-S and selecting Cursor to Center. Then press Shift-A and select Text. Then rotate it on the X-axis by pressing R, then X, then 90, then Enter. Then rotate it on the Z-axis by pressing R, then Z, then -90, then Enter. Now let's position the text. So move it on the Y-axis by pressing G, then Y, then -1, then Enter. Then position it a small distance above the floor by pressing G, then Z, then -1.07, then Enter. Now let's add some depth to the text. So click the Object Data button and set the extrude value to 0.1. Next, we'll change the text. So press Tab for edit mode. Then press Backspace to delete and enter your own text. Then press Tab to return to object mode. Now let's scale it up in size. So press S, then 1.5, then Enter. We're going to be adding a wireframe modifier, but we need to convert the text to a mesh first. So press Alt-C and select Mesh from Curve Meta Surf Text. Now add a wireframe modifier. To get rid of these spikes, remove the check mark that's next to Even Thickness. You'll notice that the wireframe is made up of long and short pieces. To make the length of the pieces more uniform, add a Remesh modifier. The Remesh modifier needs to be applied before the wireframe modifier, so click the up triangle button to move it to the top. Now remove the check mark that's next to Remove Disconnected Pieces so that the modifier will be applied to all of the letters. Next, set the octree depth value. The value that you use will depend on the length of your text. A value of 6 works well for this text. Now we'll set the material for the text, so click the Material button. Then click the small button next to the New button and select the green material. This is a good time to save what I have so far, so from the File menu I'll select Save As. I'm going to name it Factory.blend. In this animation, pieces of the text will be moving from a sphere to our text. We're going to use a particle system to accomplish this. Let's set that up now. We'll start by adding a sphere. So make sure that the 3D cursor is centered by pressing Shift-S and selecting Cursor to Center. Then press Shift-A and add a UV sphere. Then scale it down in size by pressing S, then 0.4, then Enter. Now we'll add a particle system to it. So click the Particles button. You may need to resize this panel to bring the Particles button into view. Now click the New button. This value controls the number of particles that will be used. I'm going to use 10,000. The emitter geometry normal value controls the speed at which the particles will be emitted from the sphere. Set this value to 0. If this were set to a higher value, then the particles would move away from the sphere in all directions before moving to the text. Now open the Field Weight section and set the gravity value to 0 so that gravity will not have an effect. We don't want the sphere to be visible during the animation, so find it in the outliner and click the button that looks like a camera to prevent it from being rendered. Also click the button that looks like an eye to prevent it from being displayed in the 3D view window. Then change its name to Sphere.Start. Now let's set up the particles for the text object. So right-click the text to select it. Then click the New button to add a particle system. Set the number of particles to 10,000, which is the same value that we use for the sphere. To allow this particle system to recognize the remesh and wireframe modifiers that we previously added, add a check mark next to Use Modifier Stack. Now set the gravity value to 0 so that gravity will not have an effect. We're going to set up the particles to move from the sphere to the text. To do that, we're going to use Keyed Physics. So in the Physics section, click the Keyed button. The first key will be the sphere, so click the plus button to add a key, and from the entry box, select Sphere.Start. The second key will be the text, so click the plus button to add a key, and from the entry box, select Text. Now the particles will start at the sphere and then move to the text. We can see this if I scrub through the timeline. Now let's set up some values in the emission section. Since we're using Keyed Physics, the lifetime value controls how long it takes for the particles to move from the sphere to the text. Set this value to 140. Now set the start value to 70 and the end value to 100. This will cause the particles to start being produced at frame 70 and finish being produced at frame 100. The particles will finish moving to the text 140 frames later. Now when I scrub through the timeline, you'll see the particles start moving at frame 70 and finish moving at frame 240. I'll scrub through the timeline again. This time notice that as soon as the particles start being produced at frame 70, that they begin moving. What we want is for there to be a delay between when the particles are produced and when they begin to move. We can do this by adding another key in the Physics section. So click the plus button to add another key. Then click the up arrow button to move it to the center of the other keys. Then from the entry box, select Sphere.Start. Now the particles will move from the sphere to the same sphere, which will produce no movement. Then they will move from the sphere to the text. The particles will still finish moving at frame 240, but they will move twice as fast once they start moving to the text. Now when I scrub through the timeline, the particles start being produced at frame 70, but they don't start moving until frame 140. At frame 240, they finish moving. Next, we're going to add a modifier that will break up the text into pieces. The number of pieces that will be created is controlled by the number of particles that we have. The position of the pieces will be controlled by the position of the particles. So click the Object Modifiers button and add an Explode modifier. We don't want the pieces to be visible before the particles start to be produced, so remove this check mark. Now when I scrub through the timeline, the text pieces start appearing at frame 70. They start moving at frame 140, and they finish moving at frame 240. Now let's add the sphere that moves down from the top. We'll make the sphere a little larger than these text pieces so that the text pieces will be hidden. So make sure that the 3D cursor is centered by pressing Shift-S and selecting Cursor to Center. Then press Shift-A and add a UV sphere. Then scale it down in size by pressing S, then 0.5, then Enter. Now let's smooth it out. So add a subdivision surface modifier. Set the view and render values to 2, and then click the Smooth button. The sphere is going to use the same material as the text. So click the Material button, then click the little button on the left side of the New button and select the green material. Next, let's animate the sphere. Its current position is where we want it to end up at frame 70, so move to frame 70. Then press I and select Location, Scale. Now move to frame 30. Then move the sphere on the y-axis by pressing G, then Y, then -2, then Enter. Then press I and select Location, Scale. Now move to frame 1. Then move the sphere on the z-axis by pressing G, then Z, then 2, then Enter. Then press I and select Location, Scale. This is the starting position of the sphere. Now if I scrub through the timeline, you can see how it moves. Next, we're going to animate the size of the sphere. The sphere is currently hiding the text pieces that are inside of it. We're going to shrink the size of the sphere so that the text pieces will come into view. So move to frame 140. Then scale the sphere down in size by pressing S, then 0.5, then Enter. Then press I and select Location, Scale. I'll scrub through the timeline to show what we have so far. The sphere moves into position, then it shrinks to display the text pieces, then the text pieces move to form the text. You'll notice that the sphere is still visible, so we're going to hide it right before the text pieces start moving. To do that, we'll add some keyframes to control the visibility of the sphere. So move to frame 137. We want the sphere to still be visible at this frame, so find the selected sphere in the outliner. Then right-click the button that looks like a camera and select Insert Keyframe. Then right-click the button that looks like an eye and select Insert Keyframe. Now move to frame 138. We're going to hide the sphere at this frame. So click the button that looks like a camera and the button that looks like an eye. Then right-click each of them and select Insert Keyframe. Now I'll scrub through the timeline. The sphere moves into position, then it shrinks to display the text pieces, then the text pieces move into place. And this time the sphere is not visible at the end of the animation. Now let's set up these two objects to rotate during the animation. So right-click the inside object to select it. Then move to frame 70. Now press N to open the Properties panel. Next, add a keyframe by right-clicking in the Rotation section and select Insert Keyframes. This is where the rotation will start. Now move to frame 140. We're going to rotate this object by 2 revolutions on the Z-axis, so set the Z value to 720 degrees. Then right-click on it and select Insert Keyframes. This is what it looks like when I scrub the timeline. Now right-click the outside object to select it, and then move to frame 70. Then in the Rotation section, right-click and select Insert Keyframes. Now move to frame 140. We're going to rotate this object by 2 revolutions on the x-axis in the negative direction. So set the x value to -720 degrees. We're also going to rotate it on the y-axis by 1 revolution. So set the y value to 360 degrees. Then right-click on it and select Insert Keyframes. We're done with the Properties panel for now, so press N to close it. This is what it looks like when I scrub the timeline. The last thing that we're going to animate is the position of the text. So move to frame 260. You can move the timeline by holding down the middle mouse button while dragging. Now right-click the text to select it. We're going to add a keyframe here, so press I and select Location. Now move to frame 300. The text is going to move out of view at the end of the animation, so move it on the y-axis by pressing G, then Y, then -6, then Enter. You may need to move it by a different amount depending on the length of your text. Now add a keyframe by pressing I and selecting Location. Now I'll scrub through the whole timeline. The sphere moves into position and the rotations occur. Then the text pieces move. And then the final text moves out of view. Next, let's set up the camera view, so press 0 on the number pad. This is the view looking through the camera. I'll zoom in a little. Now I'm going to lock the camera to the view. To do that, press N to open the Properties panel and put a check mark next to Lock Camera to View. then press N again to close the Properties panel. Now I can zoom, pan, and rotate while looking through the camera. I want to position the view while the text is visible, so I'm going to move to frame 260. Now I'll set up the view that I'd like to use. Now let's set the background color, so click the World button and set the color to black. I'll switch to rendered view so that we can see what this looks like. Now let's finish setting up the animation. The animation is going to be 300 frames long, so set the end frame value to 300. Now click the Render button, and then open the sampling section. I'm going to set the number of render samples to 50. The larger this value is, the better the final animation will look, but the longer it will take to render. Sometimes you can get unwanted bright speckles in the rendered image. These are sometimes referred to as fireflies. To help prevent this, I'm going to set the clamp indirect value to 1. Now come up to the Output section. This is where you set the directory where your animation will be saved. Click on this button and select a directory. Next, click here to set the file format. There are multiple movie formats that you can choose from. I'm going to use OGG Theora. Now we're ready to render the animation, but I'm going to save the project first. It's a good idea to save the project before rendering in case something goes wrong during the rendering process. To render the animation, click on the Animation button. If you want to stop the rendering process before it's done, you can press the Escape key, or you can click the X next to the Render Progress bar. Now I'll pause the video until it's done. The animation is done rendering now. It took my computer about 50 minutes to render. This is the final frame that was rendered. If you want to return to the previous view, you can click this button and select 3D View. To view the animation, go to the Render menu and click on Play Rendered Animation, or you can press Ctrl F11. The animation will play through to the end and then start back at the beginning again. Now if you open up Windows File Explorer or something equivalent, you can navigate to your movie file. Now assuming that you have a video player that will play the movie format that you specified, you can now play your video. I've set up this player to repeat the video in a loop so that it will keep playing. Well, that concludes this video. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe and leave a comment.